Welcome to our DW Business Special, looking at the economic impact of the catastrophic earthquake in Turkey and Syria. I'm Stephen Beardsley in Berlin, and today I'm joined by Erdal Yalcin, who is a professor of international economics at Konstanz University of Applied Sciences here in Germany. Welcome, Erdal. Before we get into the details of this conversation, I want to ask you a very broad question to help set up what we're going to talk about. I'd ask you to answer as briefly as possible. And the question is, what does this disaster mean for a Turkish economy that, as we know, already had many workers, families, and communities facing tough times?
Well, of course, the economic impact has various dimensions, but we have already first numbers I can refer to. We know already that around 7,000 housing buildings have been destroyed by the earthquake, and only the reconstruction of these buildings in the region will cost around $10 billion. And there are also first estimations for the whole economy. If we take further effects like infrastructure destruction, electricity and water facilities missing, business, then total costs at the moment are estimated to reach over $80 billion. That would mean around 10% of Turkey's annual output basically has been destroyed by these earthquakes.
All right, we'll get into that in a little bit, the details there. Let's begin by reminding our viewers just how devastating this earthquake has been. Well, it turned out to be the worst disaster of its kind in modern Turkish history, the earthquake striking in the dead of night on Monday, February 6th, with the epicenter near the southern city of Gaziantep. Its worst effects were felt not only in Turkey, but also in neighboring Syria, a country that was already reeling from a bloody civil war. The earthquake is one of the deadliest natural disasters to hit the globe in more than a decade. The combined death toll in Turkey and Syria from the 7.8 magnitude quake was nearing 42,000 at the time of this recording. This left tens of thousands of people homeless, and it sent an estimated 2 million people in flight from the disaster zone. Aid is still pouring into Turkey, where providing shelter is turning into the primary focus at the moment. All right, back to our guest, Erdal Yalcin. Professor, let's go back for a step. Maybe you can describe for us the economic forces that were shaping Turkish lives before this tragedy happened.
Well, that's a good point. For the last 4 years in particular, the Turkish economy has been on a negative path, but it has been an ambiguous path. Why do I say ambiguous? Because on the one hand, if we look into the statistics, the growth rate of the economy has been outstanding. For example, in 2022, official statistics state that Turkey's output grew by 6%, but that number does not reflect the average Turkish citizens' experiences. And the reasons have been that the country has been hit by very high inflation, meaning that prices in the country have been increasing over the last years dramatically. Just again, to give you numbers, in 2022, on average, according to official statistics, the prices increased by 85%. And independent institutes, they claim actually that prices increased by more than 100%. And on top, the Turkish currency has been depreciating dramatically with respect to other currencies like the US dollar. Over the 5 years, again, to put this into numbers, the Turkish lira lost more than 300%. And this is, again, important because the country is importing much more goods than it is exporting, and therefore a weak lira has been pushing prices also upwards. And of course, the timing is important. We had Corona that also hit Turkey dramatically and made the whole situation more complicated. And on top, Turkey is bordering Syria, and this had an impact in terms of immigration. Refugees arrived from Syria. At the moment, 4.5 million refugees from Syria alone are living in Turkey. And additionally, more recently, Russian and Ukrainian refugees arriving. And 8 million people are estimated to be living in cities in Turkey. And this, again, has, of course, an impact on housing prices. Again, to give you numbers, just in the last year, rental prices have tripled within 12 months. So overall, what we can say is that the living conditions for average Turkish people have been dramatically negative. Even so, the country itself published regularly positive growth rates.
So do you think that would be the experience of the average Turk if we were to ask them, middle class, let's say, that even though they have this higher growth, and that's what, as we know, President Erdogan has touted the whole time, that it's these other factors, especially the cost of living, that's really making life hard there?
It's a cost of living, and it's people actually, you need to know that 50% of the Turkish population is living on the basis of a minimum income. This minimum income is not sufficient to cover for people who don't have own housing, to cover the rent and everyday costs. So people, what they do over the last years, what we observe is private credits are increasing. People depend on taking at the end of the month, they use their credit cards. They have several credit cards in order to overcome this gap of income. And of course, the whole situation now will become more complicated because very likely a lot of, for example, the refugees who were living in the provinces that were hit by the earthquake will move to metropolitan areas, and things will become more complicated in an already complicated environment.
What about young people, young Turkish people, whether professionals or especially professionals, I should say, those who are educated and have the opportunity? Are we seeing them leave the country because of all these pressures? Or should I say, have we seen that before this earthquake?
That's a very important point. Indeed, one thing is that you have this low income fraction. On the other hand, the living conditions are affecting negatively also the people with a good education because they don't find perspectives, new jobs. One thing was that the economy is not working very well, but then there is this mismanagement, the political uncertainty, which led to a dropout of international investors. And this is declining the chances, the opportunities for well-educated people. And indeed, we see that young, well-educated medical doctors, engineers are looking for opportunities in Canada, in Europe, where they are actually welcomed.
All right, let's talk more about the earthquake itself and its scale. We spoke earlier today with Beata Yalcin. She's chief economist for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and she compared this year's disaster to the 1999 Turkish earthquake, which was smaller in scale but hit closer to Istanbul and had major economic consequences. Let's listen in.
The part of Turkey that was hit by the cataclysm this year is focusing mostly on light manufacturing and agriculture. So the hope is that the agricultural season can still be saved. And because of weaker linkages to other parts of the country, the impact will be more limited.
All right, back to our guest, Erdal Yalcin. I want to ask you about the overall comparison later with the 1999 earthquake. I want to ask you, first of all, how would you characterize this region economically? We just heard Ms. Yalcin describe it in comparison with the area around Istanbul. How would you describe it? Poor, middle class, affluent industry, tourism? It's a big area, of course.
It's a big area, but we have good statistics. We know around 15% of the population is living in these 10 provinces, but they're only responsible for about 8 to 9% of GDP. And you can see this in the average income. The average income of a citizen in that region is around 2/3 of the average Turkish income. So $6,000 in the earthquake region compared to 10,000 average income in Turkey. So it's a poorer region. But on the other hand, people still are coping to cope with everyday costs. And I agree with Beata that this region is primarily characterized by agriculture, and it's contributing to exports in the agricultural industry. So there will be also an impact on the Turkish economy, not as big as, let's say, if we compare it to a city like Istanbul, but given the economic conditions of Turkey, which we briefly sketched, we should not underestimate that there will be also negative overall effects for the Turkish economy.
What about for the people on the ground there? You said this is tends to be a poor region. Is there anything, when we look at the social safety net there for a disaster like this, is there anything like insurance? Is that widespread? Do you see that? If you're a small business owner, for example, what's likely to be your safety net if you have one at all?
Yeah, this is a very important point. Unfortunately, in principle, after the experiences of 1999, Turkey introduced laws actually to improve the regulations, the insurance regulations, the safety regulations for houses. But unfortunately, due to this mismanagement, the weakening of the institutions, the legal system is not working. Corruption has skyrocketed over the last years, and there is evidence that this government, for example, just relaxed these safety regulations for earthquake house regulations, which basically increase the risk of destruction. So that's one aspect we have to bear in mind. And the other aspect is that governmental support is very low in general in Turkey. We saw this in the corona crisis. So basically people were left on their own. They had to find ways. Private credit, relatives were very important sources to overcome these difficult situations. And it will be the same situation at the moment. The challenge is also, one thing I want to mention is, of course, there is also this political dimension of the story. If you are closer to the ruling government's party, it's easier to find money and support. For those who are obviously not supporting the government, these people have difficulties in general to get a credit, to get public support, if there is any support. So unfortunately, it's a complicated situation for the people on the ground.
We also know that across Turkey there was this kind of earthquake tax and building standards. You touched on this a little bit with the idea of the corruption that's been there. Obviously, those standards haven't been followed since the 1990 earthquake. In general, we know that President Erdogan has pointed to contractors failing there. How should we look at this? Is it a problem of the building standards there? Is it a problem of the regulators? Does it depend on where you go? For example, I heard a story also of one city in particular whose mayor was very stringent about building regulations, and that city fared pretty well. How should we look at this?
Well, I can only, as an economist, I can only bring in my insights from the statistical perspective, and I can only confirm that since 2018 in particular, when this presidential system has been introduced in Turkey, we see a continuous decline in institutional reliability, in the governments of the country. Corruption is continuously increasing. And of course, this is also reflected and confirms to what you have alluded to, that people basically don't care about regulations. The example which you mentioned, that one city was less affected due to a more restrictive mayor in the city, I read that as well, and it turns out that this mayor basically insisted on existing regulations. So the message we can basically take out is the laws are there, but the government closes both eyes if basically interest groups close to the government in particular have economic interests, like in the building industry.
You've touched on this already, but this is an area where there are, in particular, a lot of refugees. We know that Turkey in general has a great deal of refugees that it's been hosting for years as a result of the Syrian conflict, but also from elsewhere. What does this mean for them, and also for the pressures that, I think you've already alluded to this, that could fall on the housing system now that you've taken out some of that inventory? You have this greater number of bodies there in particular, of people there, refugees. That seems not to bode well for the existing inventory that has survived.
So definitely what we can expect is it will take a significant time, 2 to 5 years, to actually repair these destructions. And people, particularly refugees, will not wait 2 to 5 years in this region. We are already observing a significant large number of people moving from these regions into Western areas. And that means we are going to see an increase in prices. We will also see that the agricultural economy in that region, which relies on cheap workers, and refugees are to a large extent cheap workers, will also cope with this situation. And that will have altogether a negative impact on the people that will stay there. And at the same time, we have to bear in mind that, even so it's an agricultural area, for example, just to give you a number, the area is responsible for 22 billion US dollars of exports. If the area is basically declining in output, we are going to see negative effects on Turkey's trade balance. And that, again, is going to affect negatively Turkey's price developments. Inflation is going to increase. Living standards overall in Turkey are going to be negatively affected.
All right, the bottom line there being that this area, even though it is somewhat poorer than the rest of Turkey, can have a big impact on the rest of the country. Let's take another look at the big picture cost of this cleanup. We've alluded to this several times. Now, government officials put the damage from the earthquake at more than $50 billion. But many experts say that's unlikely to even come close to the true cost. A report by the Turkish Enterprise and Business Confederation estimates that just the repair of the thousands of homes flattened in the quake will come in well above that, at close to $71 billion alone. Add to that the loss of national income at $10.4 billion and $2.9 billion from the loss of working days, putting the total cost of the damage at $84.1 billion. Erdal, as you've mentioned, that's more than 10% of Turkey's total GDP. The damage to Turkey's infrastructure, including roads and power grids, as well as to hospitals and schools, may push the national budget deficit over 5.4% of GDP this year. All right, Professor, let's look at the big picture here. We heard before about that 1999 earthquake. Ms. Javorcik from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development saying that maybe this one won't be as devastating to the overall economy. How do you see it? You've touched on this a little bit. Will this have the same kind of impact, even a greater one perhaps than that one?
Well, as I mentioned already, as such, comparing this region with Istanbul is of course not appropriate, because a city like Istanbul or Izmir, these regions are responsible for more than 30% of Turkey's GDP, which is not the case for these provinces. And if Turkey were in a healthy economic situation with a stable government and functioning institutions, the situation would be not that dramatic. But what we see is that the inflation is high, and we have, before the earthquake, we had scheduled elections for May. And what the government started to do is already to make presents. The minimum wage has been increased by 60%, for example. This goes on the public deficit. We had also retirement ages were declined for 2 million people. This goes on the public deficit. So what has happened already before the earthquake is that the public deficit has been continuously increasing in an environment where we have already inflation, where international investors are actually leaving the country, where innovative people, those with a higher education, are leaving the country. And with this earthquake, in a region which may have not a large economic contribution, we are observing still indirect effects, negative effects. The government will have difficulties to keep inflation low. The government will have difficulties to convince international investors to come in given these fundamental figures, which are simply negative. So overall, I agree that the regional effect may be not as severe as what we have regionally observed in Istanbul, but given Turkey's economic situation at the moment, this earthquake region will have potentially negative effects on Turkey's overall economic performance in the coming 3 to 5 years.
If you look back at the earthquake from 1999, was there any sort of similar dynamic with inflation or with a currency that was struggling at the time, and so that we could sort of see how this disaster affected it? Or is this a very sort of singular instance that we're seeing right now? Because obviously Turkey has experienced multiple earthquakes, some serious ones as well. Is this new ground that it's treading right now, considering where everything was when this happened? Or is this comparable to some dynamics we saw earlier?
No, this is a very good question. If we go back to 1999, Turkey actually was structurally in a very similar situation. We had a non-functioning political situation. There were coalitions which were not able to bring the economy on track. Inflation was in three-digit numbers. Unemployment was high. And then there was this unexpected earthquake strike in Istanbul. But the major difference compared to today is that the solidarity that Turkey experienced in 1999 pushed also a positive political movement in Turkey, combined with a political positive relationship with the European Union, the European institutions. Actually, it is not an exaggeration, in my opinion, to state that the 1999 earthquake was one important reason why the current AKP party, which rules the country now for 20 years, came to power with such a positive environment, even though there was this terrible disaster in Istanbul. People just, with a push from outside, with the support, believe they can manage it. If we look today on Turkey, the political situation is terrible, but it's a difference there. There is no will to share power in the government, it seems to be. The corruption level is high, bipartisanship is very high, and I don't see this spillover, this positive spillover that can come from outside of Turkey into the country and can be turned into a positive movement. In the contrary, I'm concerned that the tensions will increase because 8 million refugees, which were also not existing in 1999, will increase living cost conditions in cities. This tension between Turks versus non-Turks will increase. We also see Europe is not interested in taking refugees. We are building walls between Turkey and Europe, for example. So there are parallels, but I'm more pessimistic, unfortunately, compared to the 1999 situation.
Professor, we've talked so much about Turkey this entire time. Is there any thoughts you can give us on its neighbor, Syria? Hasn't suffered quite the same extent of damage when we look at the number of casualties, for example, but obviously it's still devastating what has happened there. Is there any comparison here to Turkey, or any sort of insights that you could share with us about what it means for that economy there, obviously so impacted by the civil war of the past 12 years?
So I can only bring in my expertise with respect to the sanctions. Syria, given the civil war in the country, is of course confronted with international sanctions. And this comes along with challenges. Sanctions per se do not prohibit, I have to emphasize this, that foreign countries can support people in need for help, like in the northern Syrian earthquake regions. However, what we can see is that because of the sanctions, there is a huge reluctance in the private sector to get involved into support, at least via the private markets or via the private banks, because companies are uncertain whether they are allowed to help or not. And this is one reason why the northern Syrian people are in a very difficult situation. The other problem is a political problem in the north, where we observe a large a fraction of this earthquake in Syria. We have political powers that take care of regions which are opposing the Assad regime. And this, of course, creates problems in sharing support that arrives in Syria. I mean, I cannot say more except that there is this political problem and sanction-driven problems. So here the international community, of course, can do more by sending official governmental representatives or international institutions to circumvent the problems which I have mentioned.
All right, problems there that are very distinct to that country and its recent conflict. I want to ask you for one final thought in summation of everything that we've been talking about. Will this earthquake recovery present a regional challenge for the area that's affected, or will it stamp all of Turkey in the coming years? How do you see it?
I see for both. There will be a huge challenge for the region because we will see migration. We will see, on the one hand, refugees that will move, but also the well-educated people are very likely to leave the already difficult region, which is bad news in the long term for the region. And on the other hand, because of these movements, because of the difficult economic challenges, Turkey as such is confronted with a huge burden. And it is linked to the expectation that there must be a big change in the way how this country is governed. More trust, more cooperation is necessary. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for the country to overcome these costs and challenges in the short term, at least.
All right, and with that, we'll leave it there for this business special. A big thank you to Erdal Yalcin with Konstanz University. And thanks so much to you for watching. If you've enjoyed this, check out our other DW Business specials on YouTube. Otherwise, we'll see you around.